Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, and if this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. Before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. Alright, now get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we'll explore a story that challenges our understanding of family, identity, and the invisible threads that connect us to those we've never known. Tonight's case is one of complexity and tragedy, a reminder that sometimes the search for belonging can lead us down paths we never imagined. This is the story of Katie Pladdle, a young woman who went looking for her roots and found something far darker than she could have anticipated. Let yourself relax as we journey through this tale, one that unfolds slowly across 2 decades, spanning from the early days of the internet to a series of events that would leave multiple families forever changed. Our story begins in 1995, in a time when the internet was still new and mysterious, when chat rooms connected strangers across vast distances, and when a 20-year-old man named Stephen Pladdle logged on and met a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Garcia. Stephen was young himself, navigating early adulthood without direction or purpose. Alyssa was just a teenager in San Antonio, Texas, curious about the world beyond her immediate surroundings. Their online conversations grew more frequent, more intimate. What began as innocent messages transformed into something else entirely, and by the time Stephen traveled to Texas to meet Alyssa in person, a relationship had already formed that would prove impossible for the young girl to resist. Alyssa became pregnant at 16. In January 1998, when she was just 17 years old, she gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Denise. From the very beginning, Alyssa sensed something was wrong with Stephen. He was unable to hold down a job, his moods swinging unpredictably from withdrawn silence to explosive rage. The small apartment they shared became a pressure cooker of tension. Stephen would beat their cats when frustrated. He would yell until his voice cracked. And worst of all, he turned his rage toward their infant daughter. Alyssa would later recount horrifying details. Stephen would pinch baby Denise until her small body was covered in black and blue marks. When the baby cried, which infants do, Stephen couldn't tolerate the sound. He would place Denise inside a cooler and close the lid, muffling her desperate wails while Alyssa fought to free her daughter before she suffocated. He wanted to be rid of her, Alyssa would recall years later. He didn't like the crying. Alyssa faced an impossible choice. She was barely out of childhood herself, trapped with an abusive partner, watching her infant daughter suffer. Despite everything, she stayed with Stephen. They married, perhaps out of hope that things would improve, perhaps because she saw no other option. But by the time Denise was 8 months old, Alyssa knew what she had to do. It was so hard to give her up, she would say, but I had to because I wanted her to live and be happy. In 1998, Alyssa placed Denise up for adoption. It was an act of love born from desperation, a mother choosing her daughter's survival over her own desire to keep her close. Denise Pladdle became Katie Rose Fusco when she was adopted by Anthony and Kelly Fusco, a couple from Dover, New York, a small town about 80 miles north of New York City. Anthony had served in the U.S. Coast Guard before working for 20 years as a correctional officer at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. Kelly was warm and nurturing. Together they gave Katie the stable, loving home that Alyssa had dreamed of for her daughter. Katie thrived. She grew up with an adoptive sister named Nicole, and by all accounts, her childhood was entirely normal. Her uncle Kerry Gould would later describe it simply: they had a very, very normal life. He gave Katie the nickname Pac-Man because she was always eating, Always energetic, always present, Katie loved animals with a deep instinctive compassion. She became a vegetarian, drawn to protecting creatures that couldn't protect themselves. She had a particular fondness for rescuing stray cats, bringing them home and nursing them back to health. But it was art that became Katie's sanctuary and her voice. She was talented with a pen and paper, known at Dover High School for her comic strips. Her drawings were more than entertainment. They were statements. She once created an entire portfolio, depicting the struggles of women throughout American history. In her own words, written in a blog post, she explained, "A pen and something to draw on became a safe place for me. Ink became my weapon against rules and regulations. To be short, for me, a life without art is no life at all." Katie was also an activist in her own quiet way. She led a group of female students who petitioned the Dover Board of Education to change what they believed was a sexist dress code. She was unafraid to challenge authority when she felt it was unjust. By the time she graduated from Dover High School in 2016, Katie had plans. She would attend Dutchess Community College and study digital advertising, combining her artistic talents with practical career goals. Everything was set. Her future stretched before her, full of possibility. But there was one question that had always lingered in the back of Katie's mind, a question that many adopted children eventually ask: where did I come from? Who are my biological parents? When Katie turned 18 in January 2016, she decided to find out. Katie's search led her to Facebook, where she found Stephen and Alyssa Plattell. They were living in Henrico County, Virginia, near Richmond, with their two other daughters, Katie's biological half-sisters. The excitement of reconnection rippled through everyone involved. Alyssa, who had spent 18 years hoping for this moment, was overjoyed. Stephen appeared equally eager to welcome his firstborn daughter back into his life. By August 2016, Katie had made a decision that worried her adoptive parents, but one they ultimately supported. She would move to Virginia and live with the Plattells, getting to know her biological family, understanding where she came from, filling in the blank spaces of her identity. Katie didn't know that she was walking into a home that was already fracturing. By the time she arrived, Stephen and Alyssa's marriage was crumbling. They had already decided to separate and were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Alyssa had endured years of emotional and verbal abuse. "I was always on eggshells," she would later explain. Whatever his mood was, everybody knew, and that mood was often not happy. A lot of yelling, a lot of things smashed in the house, in front of our kids. Alyssa tried to warn Katie. In private conversations, she told Katie that Stephen had abused her as a baby, that his violence was the real reason she'd been given up for adoption. She wanted Katie to understand what kind of man her biological father was. But Katie, at 18, didn't seem concerned. Perhaps she couldn't imagine her charming father, so eager to connect with her, being capable of such things. Perhaps she thought Alyssa was exaggerating, driven by bitterness from a failed marriage. What happened next unfolded with a disturbing quickness. Stephen's behavior changed after Katie moved in. He began paying more attention to his appearance, shaving his beard, wearing tighter clothing. He became fixated on Katie in a way that made Alyssa deeply uncomfortable. Within weeks, Stephen began sleeping on the floor of Katie's bedroom. When Alyssa confronted him about this inappropriate behavior, Stephen told her it was none of her business. He stormed out of the house, and Katie went with him. In November 2016, just 3 months after Katie had arrived, Alyssa moved out. Stephen and Alyssa arranged shared custody of their 2 younger daughters, but the family had effectively split apart. And then Stephen and Katie were alone together in that house. Over the months that followed, something developed between Stephen and Katie that defied natural boundaries. It's here that we must pause and consider a phenomenon that experts sometimes call genetic sexual attraction, a controversial term used to describe intense physical and emotional feelings that can emerge when adopted individuals reunite with close biological relatives they've never known. Some psychologists theorize that this attraction might be a delayed response to missed bonding, the absence of the normal parent-child relationship that typically creates a natural barrier to romantic feelings. Others question whether such a phenomenon truly exists or whether it's simply a label applied to predatory behavior disguised as something more complicated. What is clear is that Stephen, a man in his early 40s with a history of abuse and manipulation, and Katie, an 18-year-old woman searching for connection and identity, began a sexual relationship. In May 2017, Alyssa discovered the truth in the most heartbreaking way possible. Her 11-year-old daughter, Katie's half-sister, had been keeping a journal. In its pages she had written, "Katie is pregnant. Dad says they feel like couples. Did they get a little too drunk that night? My dad is a slut. He's Satan." The child's journal revealed something else that made Alyssa's blood run cold. Stephen had instructed his two younger daughters to refer to Katie not as their sister but as their stepmother. When Alyssa confronted Stephen, he confirmed everything. Yes, Katie was pregnant. Yes, he was the father. And yes, he intended to marry her. Alyssa immediately reported the relationship to authorities. When the Henrico County Child Advocacy Center interviewed Stephen and Alyssa's other children, they confirmed what the journal had revealed. But by the time police issued arrest warrants, Stephen and Katie had fled to Wake County, North Carolina. On July 20, 2017, Stephen and Katie obtained a marriage license in Parkton, Maryland. They lied on the documents, falsely stating that they were not related. The ceremony was small but witnessed by people who should have known better. Stephen's mother and Katie's adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco. Why did the Fuscos attend their daughter's wedding to her biological father? Perhaps they were in denial. Perhaps they hoped that their presence would keep Katie safe, that maintaining a connection would allow them to help her eventually. Perhaps they simply didn't know what else to do. On September 4th, 2017, Katie gave birth to a son. They named him Bennett Kieron Pladdle. The baby was simultaneously Katie's son and her brother Stephen's son and grandson. Katie posted photos on social media of herself, Stephen, and baby Bennett. She used hashtags like #JenJustMarried and pregnant. To anyone scrolling past, they might have looked like any other young family celebrating new life. But the authorities had not forgotten about them. In January 2018, Knightdale police charged Stephen and Katie Pladdle with incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. They were both arrested and taken into custody in Wake County, North Carolina. The case quickly received international attention. Headlines flashed across news outlets worldwide, each one more sensational than the last. Man impregnates biological daughter, plans to marry her. The public was simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Both Stephen and Katie were extradited back to Virginia to face trial. Stephen was released on bond. Katie remained in custody initially, but was later also released on a secured bond of $12,000. The judge issued clear orders. Stephen and Katie were not to have any contact with each other. Custody of baby Bennett was awarded to Stephen's mother, who lived in Knightdale, North Carolina. Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman II, defended his client vigorously. He characterized the relationship as consensual, emphasizing that Katie was an 18-year-old woman when it began. He told reporters, "This case is an 18-year-old girl who shows up at the doorstep of a 40-year-old man who's going through difficult times with his wife. They have a bond because they're biologically related, but they never knew each other before they had a sexual relationship. He was head over heels in love with her, so much so that outweighed the issue of them being biologically related." The attorney's framing was problematic on multiple levels. It placed responsibility on Katie, portraying her as an adult making autonomous choices, while downplaying Stephen's role as her biological father, a man with a documented history of abuse, someone who should have protected her rather than exploited her vulnerability. If convicted, Stephen and Katie each faced up to 10 years in prison for the felony incest charge, plus additional time for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. After her release on bond, Katie moved back to Dover, New York, to live with Anthony and Kelly Fusco in their mobile home park. The conditions of her release required her to reside with her adoptive parents, though she was allowed to travel outside the state. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Katie would make the same trip. She and Anthony would drive to Waterbury, Connecticut, to visit Katie's adoptive grandmother, helping her clean her house and spending time with her. It became a routine, a predictable pattern. And then Katie made a phone call that would seal everyone's fate. In early April 2018, Katie called Stephen. Over the phone, she told him that she didn't want to continue their relationship. She wanted out. The exact content of that conversation will never be fully known, but Stephen's response was immediate and devastating. Katie's words had shattered whatever fantasy Stephen had constructed about their future together. In his mind, Katie wasn't just leaving him as a partner, she was abandoning him as a daughter, rejecting him completely. For Stephen, a man who had demonstrated throughout his life that he responded to loss of control with violence, this rejection became unforgivable. On April 11, 2018, Stephen convinced his mother to give him baby Bennett. He told her he wanted to take the infant to New York so that Katie could see him. His mother, trusting her son, agreed. Stephen drove back to his home on Earlston Court in Knightdale, North Carolina. There, alone with his 7-month-old son, Stephen committed an act of unspeakable cruelty. He suffocated Bennett, likely by smothering him, then hid the baby's tiny body in a closet. The next morning, April 12, 2018, Stephen's mother requested a welfare check. When Knightdale police arrived at 9 a.m., they found Bennett's body. The chief medical examiner would later confirm that the infant had died of suffocation sometime on April 11. Officers who responded to the scene were devastated. Many of our officers are mothers and fathers themselves. Police Chief Lawrence Capps would later say, "I would be lying to you if I didn't say that a situation like this certainly does stir deep emotions." But Stephen wasn't finished. While police in North Carolina were discovering Bennett's body, Stephen Pladdle was in Dover, New York, approximately 5. He had parked his minivan near the Wingdale Beer and Liquor Store, just outside the mobile home park where Katie was living with Anthony and Kelly Fusco. Surveillance cameras captured him waiting there, watching the entrance. Stephen knew Katie's routine. He knew that every Tuesday and Thursday she and Anthony would drive to Waterbury, Connecticut. He knew the route they would take. Around 8:40 that Thursday morning, Katie and her adoptive father left the mobile home park in their pickup truck, heading toward Connecticut to visit Katie's grandmother. Stephen followed them in his minivan. The drive from Dover to Waterbury takes about an hour. Katie and Anthony likely talked during the drive, perhaps about ordinary things, perhaps about Katie's future now that she was trying to rebuild her life. They had no way of knowing that Stephen was behind them, that he had brought his Arrow AR-15 style rifle, that he had already killed their grandson just hours before. At the intersection of Route 7 and 55 in New Milford, Connecticut, a rural area surrounded by farmland, Katie and Anthony stopped at a stop sign. Stephen pulled up beside their vehicle. A nearby resident, Jeff Weinzierl, was outside tending to his horses. At approximately 8:40 a.m., he heard gunfire. It sounded like he emptied out his clip, Weinzierl would later recall. It scared the bejesus out of the horses. A lot of people hunt out here, and were used to hearing gunshots, but I knew right away something was wrong with this. Stephen had opened fire with his assault rifle. shooting multiple rounds into the pickup truck. Katie died from gunshot wounds to her head, neck, torso, and upper extremities. Anthony died from similar injuries. The attack was brutal, thorough, designed to ensure neither would survive. Weinzierl immediately called. By the time police arrived, Stephen was already gone. Stephen drove approximately 18 miles from the murder scene to Dover, New York, the same small town where Katie had grown up, where she'd gone to high school, where she'd once felt safe. He pulled his minivan over on Dogtail Corners Road, near the 10-Mile River. He left the engine running, and then Stephen called his mother. The 911 call she made immediately afterward captured her anguished disbelief. "Oh God, he told me to call the police and I shouldn't go over there," she cried to the dispatcher. "He killed his baby and he's in the house," she went on. "His wife broke up with him yesterday over the phone. She's in New York and he told me he was on his way and after bringing the baby to her and then he was coming back." There was a pause, and then, "I can't even believe this is happening." A Dutchess County probation officer spotted Stephen's minivan parked on the side of the road. Police from multiple agencies converged on the location: Dutchess County Sheriff's Office, New York State Police, and New Milford Police. As officers approached the vehicle, they found Stephen Pladl dead inside, killed by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In the span of less than 24 hours, 4 people had died across 3 states: North Carolina, Connecticut, and New York. An infant, a young woman, a man who had devoted his life to protecting others, and the man who had killed them all. The investigation revealed the full timeline. Stephen had murdered his infant son on April 11, hidden his body, then driven through the night to stalk Katie. He had waited until the perfect moment, when she and Anthony were isolated on a rural road, and opened fire. After confessing to his mother, he had taken his own life rather than face justice. "We may never understand the mindset or motives of Stephen Pladl," Police Chief Lawrence Capps said at a press conference, "but we do know his actions have shattered the lives of countless people." The case sparked intense discussions about genetic sexual attraction, about the responsibilities of the court system, about how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Critics pointed out that Stephen had been released on bond despite his documented history of abuse, despite the clear power imbalance in his relationship with Katie, despite the danger he posed. Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman II, said that his client had shown no signs of violence in their final meetings. Nobody ever could have predicted Stephen's actions, he claimed. But others disagreed. Alyssa Pladl, Stephen's ex-wife and Katie's biological mother, felt devastated and betrayed. "There are no words to describe the sense of betrayal and disgust I'm feeling," Alyssa told reporters. "I waited 18 long years to have a relationship with my daughter, and now he's completely destroyed it." Alyssa had given up Katie to save her life. She had spent nearly 2 decades hoping for a reunion, and when that reunion finally came, Stephen had manipulated Katie, exploited her vulnerability, and ultimately killed her. On April 20 and 21, 2018, more than 100 people gathered at the Hoofcut Funeral Home in Dover Plains, New York for calling hours and then a funeral mass at St. Charles Borromeo Church. 3 caskets stood together: Katie Rose Fusco Pladl, age 20, Bennett Kieron Pladl, age 7 months, Anthony Charles Fusco, age 56. Katie's obituary remembered her as an artist, a creator, someone in the process of pursuing a career, using her talents and passions. It noted her love for animals, especially her commitment to rescuing stray cats. It mentioned that she was a superior drummer, a detail that many who knew her casually might not have known. Anthony's obituary described him as someone who devoted himself to the people around him, a man ripped from the lives of his wife Kelly and the rest of his family. He had served his country, served his community as a corrections officer, and in retirement had worked part-time as a security guard. He had been protecting his daughter when he died. Bennett never got the chance to have an obituary that described his personality, his interests, his dreams. He was 7 months old. His entire life had been overshadowed by the circumstances of his conception and birth, and he died before he could ever know anything different. All three were buried together in St. Charles Cemetery in Dover Plains, their graves a permanent reminder of a tragedy that never should have happened. Kelly Fosco lost both her husband and her daughter. Alyssa Platt lost the daughter she had given up to save, only to have her killed by the very man Alyssa had protected her from. Stephen and Alyssa's 2 younger daughters lost their sister, their nephew, and their father in one terrible moment. The ripples of Stephen Platt's violence extended outward, touching dozens of lives, destroying families, leaving questions that would never be fully answered. What could have been done differently? The question haunts everyone who has studied this case. Some point to the court system. Stephen was released on bond despite clear evidence of his abusive history. The judge ordered that Stephen and Katie have no contact, but there was no GPS monitoring, no mechanism to enforce that order effectively. Custody of Bennett was given to Stephen's mother, who had no way of knowing her son would use access to the child as a tool for murder. Others point to the concept of genetic sexual attraction itself, questioning whether it provides cover for predatory behavior. Stephen was 42 years old when Katie moved in with him. She was 18, technically an adult but barely out of childhood, searching for identity and belonging. The power imbalance was enormous. He was her father, someone who should have protected her, guided her, maintained appropriate boundaries. Instead, he exploited her vulnerability. Katie's own choices also raise painful questions, though they must be considered with deep empathy. Why did she enter into a relationship with Stephen? Why did she marry him? Why did she have a baby with him? The answers likely involve complex psychology, the trauma of adoption, the desire to please a biological parent she'd just met, possible manipulation and grooming by someone who had decades more life experience. We must also consider that Katie was a victim long before April 12th. She was victimized as an infant when Stephen abused her. She was victimized at 18 when he initiated a sexual relationship with her. She was victimized by a court system that failed to adequately protect her from her abuser. And she was finally fatally victimized when Stephen decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. The case also raises questions about adoption and biological reunion. Katie's story is not typical of adoptees who reconnect with birth families. The vast majority of these reunions are positive or at least neutral, but Katie's case reminds us that reunion can be dangerous when one party has a history of violence and abuse. Should there have been more caution? Should someone have insisted that Katie undergo counseling before moving in with the Platts? Should authorities have investigated Stephen's history before allowing an unsupervised reunion? These are impossible questions to answer without the benefit of hindsight. At the time, Katie was 18, legally an adult capable of making her own decisions. Her adoptive parents supported her choice to connect with her biological family because they loved her and wanted her to be happy. No one could have predicted how catastrophically wrong it would all go. The story of Katie and Stephen Platt is not a story with simple moral lessons. It's a story about the complicated nature of family, identity, and the darkness that can exist in people who appear normal on the surface. Stephen Platt was a murderer, an abuser, someone who preyed on vulnerability and responded to rejection with unspeakable violence. But to those who didn't know his history, he might have seemed like a devoted father excited to reconnect with his daughter, a man head over heels in love. Katie Platt was a victim, but she was also a person with agency, someone who made choices that we might struggle to understand. She was an artist, an activist, a young woman with dreams of a career in advertising. She was someone who loved animals and fought for what she believed was right. She was complicated, as all humans are. Anthony Fusco was a hero who died protecting his daughter. He had given Katie a safe, loving childhood. He had supported her desire to connect with her biological family even though he was worried. He had driven her to Connecticut that day, just as he had done every Tuesday and Thursday, because he loved her and wanted to help her. And Bennett Plattle was the most innocent victim of all, an infant who never had a chance to be anything other than a symbol of the dysfunction that surrounded his birth. In 2024, Lifetime made a television movie about this case called Husband, Father, Killer, the Alyssa Plattle story. It was part of their Ripped from the Headlines series. Some criticized the movie for sensationalizing the tragedy. Others felt it was important to tell the story, to honor the victims, to ensure that Katie, Anthony, and Bennett weren't forgotten. The truth is that no movie, no news article, no podcast, and no YouTube video can fully capture what happened. We can only try to understand, to piece together the evidence, to ask difficult questions, and to remember that behind every headline are real people whose lives were destroyed. As you drift toward sleep, let this story remind you that family is both the source of our greatest comfort and sometimes our deepest pain. The search for identity is a fundamental human drive, but it must be approached with caution and support. Katie Plattle was looking for belonging when she reached out to her biological parents. What she found instead was manipulation, exploitation, and ultimately death. Her story is a tragedy in the truest sense, a series of events that seemed inevitable only in hindsight, a cascade of poor decisions and missed warning signs that led to an ending no one wanted. Rest now, and remember Katie not for how she died, but for how she lived, as an artist, an activist, a young woman who loved animals and believed in fighting for what was right. Remember Anthony as a father who gave his life protecting his daughter. Remember Bennett as an innocent child who deserved better than the circumstances of his birth and death. And perhaps remember Stephen too, not with sympathy but as a warning. He represents the danger of unchecked power imbalances, of violence that simmers beneath the surface, of a system that sometimes fails to protect the vulnerable from those who would harm them. If you're still awake and listening, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, or just say I'm still here. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Now, let's move into our second story of the night. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling to the mountains of North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge peaks stretch toward darkening skies, and remote cabins sit nestled among the pines. This is a story about a family that fractured, a father and daughter whose relationship grew complicated in isolation, in a single afternoon in February that changed everything. Michael Joseph Howell was 50 years old in the winter of 2014. For years he'd made his living as a sports editor for the Columbia County News-Times, spending his days crafting headlines and shaping stories about local athletes and Friday night football games. He was the kind of man who understood small-town life, who knew that sports could bind a community together, that a well-written game recap might be the highlight of someone's breakfast table reading. But by 2014, Michael's life had shifted away from newsrooms and deadline pressures. After his divorce from Christina Rester in the late 2000s, he'd retreated to a sprawling 8-bedroom cabin in the Sheepback Mountain community near Maggie Valley, North Carolina. The property was remote, perched high where the air grew thin and cold, where neighbors were scarce and privacy was abundant. The cabin had been meant as a vacation home, a place to escape to. Instead, it became Michael's full-time residence. He wasn't alone. His daughter Crystal had come to live with him after the divorce, when she was just 12 years old. For 5 years the two shared that mountain home, father and daughter navigating life together in the isolation of those wooded heights. Crystal Brooke Howell had been 12 when her parents' marriage ended. Like many children of divorce, she'd been caught in the middle of adult decisions, her life reshaped by circumstances beyond her control. When the family split, Crystal went to live with her father while her younger sister remained with their mother in Augusta, Georgia. The years that followed weren't easy. Crystal had what family members later described as a tough upbringing. She struggled with authority, pushing against boundaries in ways that created friction with both parents. There were behavioral issues, signs that something deeper troubled her. At 12, she began counseling. Eventually, she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition marked by instability in moods, relationships, and self-image. The diagnosis suggested a young woman grappling with impulses she couldn't always control, emotions that shifted like mountain weather. Living in that remote cabin with her father, Crystal was isolated from peers, from the daily rhythms of school life that might have anchored her. The distance between their home and town meant that every errand, every social interaction required deliberate effort. Father and daughter had each other, but sometimes closeness can breed tension rather than comfort. Family members would later speak carefully about those years. Crystal's aunt mentioned that there were issues, complications that had compounded over time. She insisted that Crystal wasn't a monster, that the story was more complex than it might appear. But whatever troubles existed within that cabin, they remained largely private, hidden behind the tree line in the mountain's quiet. The day began ordinarily enough. It was Monday, February 24th, and the mountain air carried the last bite of winter. Michael and Crystal drove down from Sheepback Mountain to the Ingalls grocery store in Canton. Surveillance cameras captured them that afternoon, moving through the aisles together, just a father and daughter running errands, shopping for whatever provisions they needed for the coming week. But something happened during that trip. Crystal attempted to shoplift something from the store. The details of what she tried to take have never been made fully public, but Michael caught her in the act. For a father, especially one who'd worked in journalism and valued integrity, the disappointment must have been sharp. For a 17-year-old already struggling with authority and boundaries, being caught must have felt like humiliation. They drove back to the cabin together, the silence between them heavy with Michael's disapproval and Crystal's shame. When they arrived home, Michael was exhausted. Perhaps from the confrontation, perhaps from the general weight of raising a troubled teenager alone on that mountain. He lay down on the couch in the living room to take a nap. Crystal went to take a shower. The water ran hot, steam filling the bathroom as she stood beneath the spray, and according to what she would later tell investigators, it was there, in that enclosed space, with water pounding around her, that her thoughts turned dark. She thought about what had happened at the store. She thought about her father's disappointment. She thought about her life, trapped on this mountain with nowhere to go and no way out. And she thought about killing him. When Crystal emerged from the shower, something had crystallized in her mind. She moved through the cabin with purpose now, wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. She knew where her father kept the shotgun. It wasn't unusual for a family in rural North Carolina to have firearms in the house, especially this far from town, where response times for emergencies could stretch long. Michael was still asleep on the couch, his breathing slow and steady. He had no idea his daughter was approaching, no warning of what came next. Crystal raised the shotgun and aimed it at his head. There was no confrontation, no final words exchanged, just a single shot that echoed through the empty cabin and ended Michael Howell's life instantly. In that moment, everything changed. Crystal had acted on an impulse that she'd never be able to take back. Years later, she would claim on a podcast that there'd been no thinking, that it happened too fast for contemplation. But prosecutors would paint a different picture, describing how she'd pondered the act while showering, how she'd made a conscious choice, and then executed it with cold precision. Either way, when the sound of the gunshot faded, 50-year-old Michael Howell was dead on his own couch, killed by his own daughter in his own home. Now, Crystal faced a new reality. Her father's body lay before her, undeniable evidence of what she'd done. Many teenagers might have panicked, might have called the police in a state of shock or remorse. Crystal did neither. Instead, she began to cover her tracks with methodical care. First, she had to deal with the couch itself, soaked now with her father's blood. She managed to get it out of the house and dispose of it, though the specifics of how a 17-year-old girl moved that heavy piece of furniture remain unclear. Then came the body itself. Crystal found a large plastic storage container, and through means that require imagination to comprehend, she placed her father's body inside it. She wrapped him in a sleeping bag, leaving him dressed in the same clothes he'd worn to the grocery store that morning. Then she carried or dragged the container out to the property's storage shed, where she hid it among whatever else was stored there. The shotgun that she'd used had to go too. Crystal sold it, turning the murder weapon into cash that would help her maintain the lie she was about to construct. With the physical evidence hidden or disposed of, Crystal began building her story. She contacted friends with devastating news. Her father had gone to Georgia and committed suicide. The story was plausible enough. Michael had been divorced, had been living in isolation. Depression could strike anyone. Her friends had no reason to doubt her, no cause to question the word of someone they knew. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. For nearly a month, Crystal lived freely in her father's cabin with his body hidden mere yards away in the storage shed. She didn't quietly grieve or live in fearful isolation. Instead, she transformed the house into something her father would never have permitted. She invited friends to move in with her. The isolated cabin that had been home to just father and daughter suddenly hosted multiple teenagers, free from adult supervision. Crystal began spending Michael's money, accessing whatever accounts and cash he'd left behind. She drove his distinctive orange Land Rover wherever she pleased, no longer constrained by his rules or disapproval. The cabin became a venue for parties. According to prosecutors, these were drug-fueled gatherings, the kind that would have horrified Michael had he been alive to witness them. At some point during this month, Crystal even had a stripper pole installed in the kitchen, the images jarring, almost absurd. A piece of equipment more suited to a nightclub appearing in a family home where a murdered man's body lay hidden just outside. To those who visited during this time, everything seemed fine. Crystal appeared to be a teenager finally experiencing freedom. She told anyone who asked that her father had released her from his custody, that he'd moved on with his life and left her to live her own. She made it all seem normal, reasonable even. But in the shed, wrapped in that sleeping bag inside the plastic container, Michael Howell's body remained, a secret that couldn't stay hidden forever. March 22, 2014. Nearly a month had passed since Michael's death. Some of Crystal's friends were at the cabin, and they'd decided to move a pinball machine into the storage shed. It was just a casual task, the kind of thing you do when you're young and living in a house with space to spare. But when they opened the shed and began moving things around to make room for the pinball machine, they found the plastic container. Perhaps curiosity got the better of them, or perhaps something about it seemed wrong. When they opened it, they discovered Michael Howell's body. The discovery must have been horrifying. To find a corpse is traumatic enough, but to realize it's the father of your friend, a man you may have known, a man who'd been missing for weeks while you'd been partying in his house, the psychological impact would have been enormous. The friends immediately called the Waynesville Police Department. Within hours, the cabin was transformed into a crime scene. Officers and investigators swarmed the property, documenting everything, photographing the shed, beginning the process of unraveling what had happened. Crystal wasn't at the cabin when her friends made their discovery. Just 3 days earlier, on March 19th, she'd called her mother Christina. In Augusta, Georgia, she'd told Christina that Michael had released her from his custody and that she wanted to move back home. Christina, being a responsible parent, had told her daughter she'd need proof of emancipation before allowing such a move. But Crystal hadn't let that deter her. On March 22nd, the same day her friends found her father's body, Crystal showed up at Christina's house in Augusta. She was driving Michael's orange Land Rover and towing a U-Haul trailer packed with her belongings. She'd taken $3,000 in cash from the cabin. She'd even told one of her friends to stay behind and keep paying the bills on the property. Crystal didn't make it far. The police in North Carolina quickly identified her as a suspect, and by March 23rd, just 1 day after her father's body was discovered, officers tracked her down to a Motel 6 in Richmond County, Georgia. She was taken into custody without incident. During questioning, Crystal's story began to unravel. At first, she claimed it had been an accident, that the shotgun's safety had malfunctioned. But investigators knew better. The evidence didn't support an accidental discharge, especially not one that resulted in Michael being shot in the head while he slept. Eventually, Crystal admitted the truth. She told them about being caught shoplifting at Ingalls. She told them about returning home and taking a shower. She told them about thinking about killing her father, and she told them about walking out of that bathroom, taking the shotgun, and shooting him while he napped on the couch. The autopsy confirmed what they already knew. Michael had died from a single shotgun wound to the head. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. He'd been killed in his sleep, unaware of what was coming. Crystal was extradited back to North Carolina and taken to the Haywood County Detention Center. There, she would remain for the next 2.5 years while her case slowly moved through the legal system. The case against Crystal Brooke Howell was straightforward in its facts, but complicated in its implications. She was charged with first-degree murder, concealment of death, and failure to report a death not from natural causes. First-degree murder in North Carolina implies premeditation, the kind of planning and forethought that distinguishes it from crimes of passion or accidents. Prosecutors believed they had clear evidence of premeditation. Crystal had admitted to thinking about killing her father while she showered. She'd then emerged from the bathroom, retrieved the weapon, and carried out the act. The shooting itself might have taken only seconds, but those moments in the shower, those thoughts turning over in her mind, that was where the murder truly began. After the killing, Crystal had shown clear consciousness of guilt through her cover-up efforts. She'd hidden the body, disposed of evidence, sold the murder weapon, and lied to everyone about what had happened. She'd spent a month living freely while keeping her father's corpse hidden. To prosecutors, these actions demonstrated not just guilt, but a calculating coldness. Crystal's defense attorney, Bridget Aguirre, took a different approach. She emphasized her client's mental health history, the borderline personality disorder diagnosis, the years of counseling, the instability that had marked Crystal's teenage years. The defense wasn't arguing that Crystal was innocent, but rather that context mattered. A troubled 17-year-old with documented mental health issues had made a terrible decision in a moment of emotional turmoil. District Attorney Ashley Welch, however, countered that Crystal's actions after the murder told the real story. The month of parties, the spending of her father's money, the stripper pole in the kitchen, these weren't the actions of someone overwhelmed by mental illness. These were the actions of someone who wanted freedom at any cost, someone willing to kill to live life on her own terms. On October 10, 2016, 2.5 years after Michael Howell's death, Crystal Brooke Howell appeared in Haywood County Superior Court. She stood before the judge in her prison clothes, unshackled, her voice barely above a whisper as she pleaded guilty to all charges. There would be no trial, no jury deliberation. Crystal was accepting responsibility for what she'd done, whether this came from genuine remorse, practical calculation, or legal advice. Only she could say. Her mother Christina sat in the courtroom with Crystal's younger sister Sierra. They held each other and quietly sobbed as Crystal admitted her guilt, whatever complicated feelings they had. Watching a daughter and sister confess to murder, they had to process them in that public space. The sentencing came swiftly. For the concealment charges, Crystal received 60 to 84 months in prison. For the murder itself, she received a minimum of 25 years, to be served after the initial sentence. In total, she would need to serve approximately 30 years before becoming eligible for parole. She received credit for the 93 days she'd already spent in pre-trial confinement. The judge addressed Crystal directly before pronouncing sentence. He told her that taking responsibility was the first step toward moving forward, toward any possibility of healing. He read from a statement Christina had written, words expressing that she wouldn't give up on her daughter, that she hoped Crystal would find peace with help and counseling. Assistant District Attorney Jeff Jones summarized the state's case one final time. Crystal had been caught shoplifting, had thought about killing her father while showering, and had then executed him while he slept. She'd hidden the body, dumped the couch, sold the gun, and covered up the crime for more than a month. It was calculated, it was cold, it was murder in the first degree. District Attorney Ashley Welch spoke to the motive behind it all. The shocking part wasn't just that a young woman had killed her father, but that she'd then spent his money, used his house, drove his car, all while his body lay hid. She'd wanted to live on her own terms, and Michael Howell's life had been the price. Crystal's aunt, Brenda Ellis, spoke to reporters afterward. She insisted there was more to Crystal than had come out in court, that there had been so many issues compounding over the years. She said Crystal wasn't a monster, that the whole thing was a heartbreaking tragedy, but what those additional issues were, she didn't specify. Crystal Brooke Howell was transferred to the North Carolina Department of Adult Corrections, where she would serve her sentence. Eventually, she was housed at the Anson Correctional Institution in Polkton, North Carolina. There she would spend her 20s and much of her 30s, assuming she serves the full minimum sentence before parole. In 2023, nearly a decade after her father's death, Crystal participated in a podcast series titled Killing Dad, a First-Degree Mistake. It was the first time she'd spoken publicly about the case. Now 26 years old, she offered a different version of events than the one presented in court. She claimed she'd never sat there and thought about killing anyone or hurting anyone. She insisted it happened so fast there was no thinking, that it was basically an impulse. This contradicted the prosecution's case and her own earlier statements about contemplating the act while showering. She also denied killing her father for money or freedom, saying that authorities wanted to believe that narrative because it made it easier to put a child in prison for life. The podcast promised to present previously unknown information, to include perspectives from friends who'd moved into the cabin and discovered the body, even to reveal details about an alleged accomplice who helped dispose of evidence. It asked listeners to decide for themselves whether Crystal deserved the lengthy sentence she'd received, noting that there's no nationwide standard for sentencing teenagers who commit murder. Michael Howell's family has largely remained out of the public eye. Christina Rester, who lost her ex-husband and saw her daughter imprisoned, has had to navigate grief and loss in ways few can imagine. Crystal's younger sister, Sierra, has had to process the knowledge that her sibling killed their father. The ripples of that February afternoon have spread outward, affecting everyone who knew the Howell family. The case of Crystal Brooke Howell and Michael Howell raises questions that have no easy answers. What happens when mental illness intersects with adolescence? How do we understand impulse versus premeditation in the teenage brain? When does a troubled child become a criminal who must be held accountable? The mountains of North Carolina still stand, unchanging despite the violence that occurred there. The cabin on Sheepback Mountain has passed to other hands. The Ingalls grocery store in Canton continues its daily business, though surveillance footage from that February afternoon remains part of a murder file. Crystal sits in prison, serving a sentence that will likely keep her incarcerated until she's well into her 40s. Michael Howell rests in a grave, his life cut short at 50, his death at the hands of the daughter he'd raised alone for 5 years. The truth lies somewhere in the complicated space between the prosecution's narrative of a calculated killer and the defense's portrait of a troubled teen making an impulsive, terrible choice. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps it's neither. Perhaps it's something else entirely that we, looking in from the outside, can never fully understand. But this much remains clear. On February 24, 2014, a father took a nap on his couch and never woke up. A daughter made a choice that destroyed 2 lives, her father's, and in many ways her own. And in the silence of a mountain cabin, a family ended. Please, if you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me the time in your corner of the world, or just say something to show you're still awake. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy these midnight stories. Alright, let's continue with our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to explore a story about ambition and love, about secrets hidden in plain sight, and about how one cold January morning shattered the promise of a bright future. This is the story of Danita Smith, a young woman whose camera captured the world around her, whose dreams were almost within reach, and whose life ended on a stairwell in Durham, North Carolina. As you settle into the quiet darkness, let me take you back to 2007, to a university campus, to a love triangle that turned deadly, and to the question that would haunt 2 families forever: who really pulled the trigger? Breathe slowly. Listen carefully. This is a story about truth and lies, about the thin line between love and obsession. This is the story of Danita Smith. In the winter of 2007, Danita Monique Smith was 25 years old, and standing on the edge of everything she'd worked for. Born in Charlotte, North Carolina, on November 20, 1981, Danita had grown up with a camera in her hands, and a hunger to tell stories that mattered. Her mother, Sharon, remembered her daughter's relationship with photography as something almost spiritual. The camera wasn't just a tool for Danita, it was her language, her way of making sense of the world. Through the lens she found her voice. At North Carolina Central University in Durham, Danita had built an impressive reputation. She wasn't just another graduate student pursuing a master's degree in mass communications, she was someone people noticed, someone they remembered. Her undergraduate years at NCCU had been filled with achievement after achievement: staff photographer for the Campus Echo student newspaper from 2001 to 2004, a fellowship at the prestigious New York Times Student Journalism Institute, membership in the Sigma Tau Delta International English Honor Society. But Danita was more than her resume. She played the saxophone in the Sound Machine marching band, her music filling football stadiums on autumn afternoons. She sang with the Worship and Praise Inspirational Mass Choir, her voice rising in harmony with others. She worked at the writing studio, helping fellow students find the words they couldn't quite grasp on their own. Chancellor James Ammons called her one of the university's academic stars. Her professors spoke of her graceful composure, her kindness, her ability to excel without arrogance. Gerard Farrow, a former arts and entertainment editor at the Campus Echo who worked closely with Danita, would later say that for anyone who knew her, sadness would always hang in the air at her memory. In January 2007, Danita was in the final semester of her graduate program. Her thesis was nearly complete. Graduation was just months away, and with it, the launch of a career she'd been building towards since she was young. The photojournalism world was opening its doors to her, and there was something else. Something that made everything feel complete. She was engaged. His name was Jermaine Stroud, and to Danita he was everything she'd hoped for in a partner. They'd met during their college years at NCCU, and over 6 years their relationship had deepened into something she believed was unshakable. He was a Greensboro police officer, responsible, dedicated, protective. They'd been engaged since November 2006, just 2 months earlier. Danita's best friend, Edith Kearns, remembered how Danita would gush about Jermaine. Before I even met him, Danita spoke very highly of him, Edith recalled. She said he was a gentleman, intelligent, active, involved, well-rounded, kind. She said he respected her, protected her, loved her. To Danita, Jermaine was her perfect man. She envisioned a future filled with love, marriage, and professional success. She had no idea that the man she loved was living a double life. She had no idea that someone she'd never met was watching her. And she had no idea that she had only days to live. While Danita Smith was planning her wedding and finishing her thesis in Durham, 50 miles away in Greensboro, another woman believed she had a claim on Jermaine Stroud's heart. Her name was Shannon Elizabeth Crawley. Shannon was 27 years old in January 2007, a single mother of 2 children, a 10-year-old boy, and an 8-year-old girl. She worked as a 911 dispatcher for Guilford Metro 911 in Greensboro, the same city where Jermaine worked as a police officer. That's how they met. Through work, through proximity, through opportunity. According to investigators, their relationship began sometime in 2004, evolving from friendly workplace interactions into something more intimate by late 2004. What started casually turned sexual, and Shannon, it seemed, wanted more than Jermaine was willing to give. During their affair, Shannon became pregnant. The pregnancy forced a reckoning. According to both Shannon and Jermaine's later statements to police, Jermaine made it clear he didn't want to have a child with her. Shannon had an abortion, and shortly after that, Jermaine ended the physical relationship. This was in 2005, roughly a year before Danita's murder. But ending a relationship on paper and ending it in reality are two different things. According to Jermaine, Shannon wouldn't let go. She continued calling him at work. She would show up at his house. She lived just down the street from him, close enough to watch, close enough to know his routines, close enough to see when another woman was in his life. Shannon's co-workers would later tell investigators a different story. They said Jermaine was the one who kept calling Shannon at the dispatch center, sometimes multiple times a day. They described him as controlling, possessive, unable to accept that she'd moved on. Two competing narratives, two different versions of who was pursuing whom. Two people, each claiming to be the victim of the other's obsession. But there was one thing both agreed on. Shannon knew about Danita. She knew that Jermaine was engaged to another woman. She knew Danita's name, where she lived, what she looked like. Danita, meanwhile, knew nothing about Shannon Crawley. Jermaine had kept that part of his life completely hidden from her. As far as Danita knew, she was the only woman in Jermaine's life. She had no reason to look over her shoulder, no reason to be afraid. Shannon, however, had reason to be angry. In October 2006, just 3 months before Danita would be killed, Shannon purchased a gun. It was a .38 caliber Taurus special revolver. bought from a co-worker named Ronald Simpson. When investigators later asked Shannon why she'd bought the gun, she claimed it was for protection. She said she was afraid of Jermaine, afraid he would hurt her. But she never reported any threats to the police. She never filed a restraining order. She never told her family she was in danger. She just bought a gun and waited. Thursday morning, January 4th, 2007, began like any other winter day in Durham. The campus of North Carolina Central University was quiet in the early hours, students still on holiday break or sleeping off the lingering haze of the New Year's celebrations. At the Campus Crossings Apartments on East Cornwallis Road, Danita Smith was preparing to start her day. She lived alone in one of the units, a modest apartment that served as both her home and her creative workspace. Her camera equipment, her thesis materials, her photographs, everything that mattered to her was there. It was cold that morning, the kind of cold that makes you pull your coat tighter as you walk. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Michael Hedgepeth, the maintenance director for Campus Crossings, was making his rounds through the complex. The morning was still quiet, the kind of quiet that makes sudden sounds feel louder than they should be. And then he heard it, a gunshot, sharp, unmistakable, echoing off the buildings. Michael immediately looked toward the 1100 building, the direction the sound had come from. That's when he saw a woman running, not walking, running from the back of the building toward the front. The route she took struck him as unusual. There was a more convenient exit to the parking lot, but she wasn't taking it. She was moving fast, urgently, as if fleeing from something. Michael got in his vehicle and drove toward the building to investigate. As he approached, he saw a young black woman in a burgundy Ford Explorer, pulling out of the parking area. The woman appeared hysterical. She was crying, shaking, clearly distressed. Michael stopped her, concerned. He asked what was wrong, if she'd heard the gunshot. The woman told him yes, she'd heard it. She said she was afraid of guns. She was terrified. She wanted him to stay with her. Michael told her to wait while he called the police to check on the source of the gunfire. But when he turned away to make the call, the woman drove off, just left, gone. Michael noted the vehicle burgundy Ford Explorer and the description of the driver black female, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, wearing her hair in a ponytail. Then he went to investigate the building. At first he found nothing. The area seemed clear, but 2 hours later, at approximately 10 hours in a.m., another Campus Crossings resident named Corey Smith was leaving his apartment to go to work. As he descended the stairwell of the 1100 building, he noticed something strange. Personal belongings were scattered down the stairs, a purse, a phone, other items, strewn as if someone had dropped them in a hurry or a fall. At the bottom of the stairwell, he saw a woman's body. She was lying face down on the concrete sidewalk. Her position suggested she'd fallen or been pushed down the stairs. Corey immediately approached, hoping she was just unconscious, maybe injured from a fall. But when he got close enough, he could see she wasn't breathing. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. Following the dispatcher's instructions, he checked the purse on the stairs for identification. Inside, he found a student ID. The woman's name was Danita Monique Smith. When paramedics arrived minutes later, they confirmed what Corey already knew. Danita was dead. Corolla Lack, one of the first paramedics on scene, determined that she'd been deceased for some time, likely since shortly after that gunshot Michael Hedgepeth had heard 2 hours earlier. An autopsy would later reveal the cause of death, a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Danita had been shot at close range while walking down the stairs. The bullet entered the base of her skull, and she fell forward, tumbling down the concrete steps, her body coming to rest on the sidewalk below. She died almost instantly. She likely never saw her killer's face, Her purse and belongings had spilled down the stairs as she fell. Her phone, still in her hand, had clattered away. Her camera, her future, her wedding plans, all of it ended in a single moment of violence. By noon, word had spread through the NCCU campus. Danita Smith, the photojournalist, the graduate student, the bright star everyone admired, was dead, murdered, and no one knew why. As news of Danita's death spread, her loved ones rushed to the scene. Among them was her fiancé, Jermaire Stroud. Jermaire arrived at campus crossings around midday, visibly shaken. He spoke with Detective Sean Pate, one of the lead investigators assigned to the case. Jermaire was grief-stricken, asking questions, demanding answers. Who had done this? Why? Did they have any leads? In homicide investigations, detectives always look closely at the people closest to the victim. Statistically, when a woman is murdered, the perpetrator is often someone she knows, a partner, an ex, a family member. So Detective Pate asked Jermaire the question he had to ask: "Where were you this morning?" Jermaire explained that he'd worked the night shift as a police officer in Greensboro and had come home around 7 a.m. to sleep. He said he was alone at his house, about 50 miles away from Durham. He had no alibi, no one to confirm his whereabouts, but he also had no apparent motive. He was engaged to Danita. He seemed genuinely devastated by her death. Detectives noted his statement and allowed him to leave. They spent the rest of the day with his family and Danita's family, comforting them, trying to make sense of the senseless. The next day, January 5, investigators reached out to Jermaire again with more specific questions. They asked him about the maintenance worker's description of the woman in the burgundy Ford Explorer. They asked him a question that would change everything. "Do you know anyone who drives a burgundy SUV?" Without hesitation, Jermaire answered, "Yes, Shannon Crawley." And then the floodgates opened. Jermaire admitted to the affair. He told investigators that he and Shannon had been involved from late 2004 into 2005. He told them about the pregnancy, the abortion, the end of the relationship. He told them Shannon lived just down the street from him in Greensboro. He told them she drove a burgundy Ford Explorer, and he told them something else. He said Shannon had been stalking him, that she wouldn't leave him alone, that she called him constantly at work, showed up at his house, watched him. He said he'd tried to end things but she wouldn't accept it. He said she knew about Danita, knew they were engaged. He said Shannon had been carrying a gun. Detectives immediately drove to Greensboro to speak with Shannon Crawley. They found her at the Guilford Metro 911 dispatch center, where she worked. At first, Shannon seemed cooperative. She agreed to speak with them. She told investigators she'd been at home in Greensboro that morning, taking one of her children to a pediatrician appointment. She said she had nothing to do with Danita's death. She admitted she knew Jermaire but claimed their relationship had ended long ago. She said she had no reason to harm Danita. She didn't even know her. As the interview was wrapping up, one of Shannon's co-workers approached Detective Pate and slipped him a note. The note said that someone else wanted to speak with him, someone who had information about Shannon and Jermaire. That co-worker told Pate that Jermaire had been calling Shannon at the dispatch center constantly for months, multiple times a day, sometimes 10 times in a single day. The co-worker described Jermaire as controlling, obsessive, unable to let go. This contradicted Jermaire's claim that Shannon was the one who wouldn't leave him alone. Then the co-worker revealed something even more damning. In October 2006, just 3 months before Danita's murder, he'd sold Shannon a gun, a .38 caliber Taurus special revolver. Detective Pate asked Shannon about the gun. At first she denied owning one. When confronted with the fact that her co-worker had sold it to her, she changed her story. She admitted buying the gun but claimed she'd thrown it away shortly after receiving it, tossed it in a dumpster along with the ammunition. Detectives didn't believe her. Over the following days, investigators worked quickly to build their case. They obtained Shannon's phone records, her vehicle records, and began tracking her movements on the morning of January. What they found was damning. Shannon had told police she was in Greensboro all morning, taking her child to the doctor. But when detectives contacted the pediatrician's office, they learned that Shannon had never shown up for the appointment. She'd canceled or simply hadn't attended. Cell phone tower data painted an even clearer picture. Shannon's phone had pinged off towers in Durham, 60 miles from her home, around the time of the murder. The phone data placed her in the vicinity of Campus Crossings apartments when Danita was shot. Jermaire's phone records, by contrast, showed his phone had remained in Greensboro all morning, consistent with his claim that he'd been sleeping at home. Forensic analysis of the bullet recovered from Danita's body revealed it came from a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun Shannon had purchased 3 months earlier. Ballistics experts identified 8 possible firearms that could have fired the fatal shot, including a Taurus, the exact make Shannon had bought. When forensic technicians examined Shannon's Ford Explorer, they found gunshot residue on the steering wheel. On January 9, 2007, 5 days after Danita's murder, Durham police arrested Shannon Elizabeth Crawley and charged her with first-degree murder. Shannon was taken into custody, booked, and held without bond. Her arrest sent shockwaves through Greensboro. She was a 911 dispatcher, a single mother of 2 young children. To those who knew her, the idea that she could murder someone seemed impossible, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Her bail was eventually set at $175,000. 4 months after her arrest, Shannon posted bail and was released while awaiting trial. Her case wouldn't go to trial for another 3 years. And during those 3 years, Shannon would make increasingly desperate attempts to shift blame onto the one person she claimed was truly responsible for Danita's death, Jermaire Stroud. By the time Shannon Crawley's trial began in February 2010, more than 3 years had passed since Danita Smith's murder. The case had been delayed twice, and public interest remained intense. Shannon's defense attorney C. Scott Holmes built his strategy around a single claim: Jermaire Stroud killed Danita Smith, not Shannon Crawley. According to Shannon's version of events, told to police 5 months after her arrest in May 2007, Jermaire had broken into her home on January 3, the day before the murder. She claimed he was armed, threatened her and forced her to drive with him to Durham, to Campus Crossings. She said they drove around the complex, scouting it out, before returning to Greensboro. The next morning, Shannon claimed the same thing happened. Jermaire allegedly forced his way into her home again, threatened her children, and demanded she drive him back to Durham. She said he hid in the back of her SUV as they drove. When they arrived at Campus Crossings, Jermaire allegedly got out of the vehicle and approached Danita as she was walking down the stairs. Shannon claimed she heard arguing. Then a gunshot. She said Jermaire ran back to the vehicle, jumped in the back and forced her to drive away. She said he was hiding in the back seat, crouched down when she encountered Michael Hedgepeth, the maintenance worker. That's why she claimed Hedgepeth didn't see anyone else in the vehicle. It was an elaborate story, but prosecutors argued it was just that, a story, and a poorly constructed one at that. Durham County Chief Assistant District Attorney David Sachs methodically dismantled Shannon's defense. He pointed out that Shannon had waited 5 months after her arrest to tell this story to police. 5 months. If Jermaire had truly threatened her, held her at gunpoint, forced her to participate in a murder, why hadn't she told police immediately? Why had she initially lied about owning a gun? Why had she lied about her whereabouts that morning? Sachs presented the phone records showing Shannon's phone in Durham and Jermaire's phone in Greensboro. He presented the forensic evidence, the gunshot residue on Shannon's steering wheel, the ballistics evidence linking the bullet to a gun like the one Shannon had purchased. He presented testimony from Shannon's co-worker Ronald Simpson, who confirmed he'd sold Shannon the .38 Taurus revolver in October 2006, just 3 months before the murder. Shannon had initially denied owning a gun, then claimed she'd thrown it away, but no gun was ever found. Jermaire Stroud owned 2 weapons, a .40 caliber Sig Sauer and a .40 caliber Glock 23. Forensic experts testified that a .40 caliber weapon cannot fire a .48 caliber bullet. The bullet that killed Danita came from a .48 caliber revolver, the same type of gun Shannon had purchased and then couldn't account for. Sachs presented testimony from Shannon's co-workers, who described her behavior in the days after the murder. She seemed calm, unaffected. She came to work. She functioned normally. She showed no signs of trauma, no signs of fear. If she'd truly been threatened, held hostage, forced to participate in a murder, wouldn't she have been terrified? Wouldn't she have shown some sign of distress? But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from Shannon herself. During the trial, the defense played audio recordings Shannon had made of what she claimed were phone conversations with Jermaire. In these recordings, a male voice, supposedly Jermaire's, whispered confessions. The voice admitted to killing Danita. The voice said he couldn't go to prison. But the voice didn't sound like Jermaire. Even Shannon's own attorney, Scott Holmes, acknowledged the tapes were problematic. "It's pretty convenient," Holmes said in court. "That didn't sound like the Jermaire who took the stand, did it? That sounded like Michael Jackson or something." Prosecutors argued the recordings were fabricated. They pointed out that the confessions on the tapes matched Shannon's story too exactly. It seemed as though someone was reading from a script. When Jermaire took the stand, he denied everything. He denied forcing Shannon to drive to Durham. He denied killing Danita. He denied making the phone calls Shannon claimed to have recorded. Shannon also took the stand in her own defense. She testified about the alleged abuse, the threats, the fear she lived in. She cried. She pleaded with the jury to believe her, but the jury didn't. After deliberating for approximately 7 hours over 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict on guilty of first-degree murder. Shannon showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Judge Ronald Stevens immediately sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Danita's mother, Sharon Smith, addressed Shannon directly. "Because of what you did, there is a void. You took her away from me. Someday I may forgive you, but right now I don't, and I hope you rot in hell. You're vile. You don't deserve to be a mother." Shannon's parents, however, remained convinced of their daughter's innocence. Her father, Keith Crawley, vowed to continue fighting. "If it is the last thing I ever do, I will prove that he is the one that actually committed that crime. I won't rest and I won't stop until he's where he belongs, in jail." Even Judge Stevens, who had presided over the trial and upheld the jury's verdict, seemed troubled by the broader circumstances of the case. As he sentenced Shannon, he said, "Jermaire Stroud caused a perfect storm to happen, and then walked away from it, and that was unfortunate for everyone in this case." Shannon's attempts to implicate Jermaire didn't end with her conviction. In June 2008, while Shannon was out on bail awaiting trial, she made a shocking allegation to Charlotte police. She claimed that Jermaire had come to Charlotte in the early morning hours, found her walking her dog near her family's home, and violently attacked her. She alleged that Jermaire had held a knife to her throat, cut off her clothes, cut her thigh, and sexually assaulted her over a period of several hours from approximately 2:30 a.m. Police took the accusation seriously and launched an immediate investigation. A sexual assault unit detective, Pamela Zinkin, interviewed Shannon and ordered a forensic examination. But the investigation quickly unraveled. A medical examination found no physical evidence of sexual assault. No semen was recovered. The injuries Shannon claimed to have sustained were not consistent with her story. More critically, investigators obtained Germair's cell phone records for the time in question. The records showed that based on the timeline Shannon provided and the location data from Germair's phone, he would have had to travel from Charlotte to Greensboro at approximately 1 hours per hour without stopping for a single red light to have committed the assault, and then returned home in time for the phone data to place him in Greensboro. It was physically impossible. Investigators also found surveillance footage that accounted for Germair's whereabouts that morning. He had not been in Charlotte. Shannon had lied. Again. The false rape accusation only served to further damage Shannon's credibility. Prosecutors argued it demonstrated a pattern. Shannon was willing to fabricate elaborate stories to frame Germair for crimes he didn't commit. Shannon Elizabeth Crawley is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. She continues to maintain her innocence, insisting that Germair Stroud is the one who murdered Danita Smith. She filed an appeal in 2010, challenging her conviction on multiple grounds. The North Carolina Court of Appeals denied her appeal in 2011, upholding the jury's verdict and the trial court's rulings. Germair Stroud was never charged with any crime in connection with Danita's death. The Greensboro Police Department conducted a thorough investigation and found no evidence linking him to the murder. Chief Tim Bellamy stated publicly that Germair was never a suspect and that no allegations against him surfaced until Shannon's defense raised them at trial. According to some reports, Germair remarried less than a year after Danita's death, though this has not been independently confirmed. He declined to be interviewed for Deadline NBC's coverage of the case, but did provide a statement denying any involvement in Danita's murder and refuting all of Shannon's allegations. For Danita's family, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring their daughter back. Danita's father, Calvin Smith, said after the verdict, "I was thankful to God for the guilty verdict because I was glad that Danita didn't get murdered twice." Her mother, Sharon, continues to mourn the daughter she lost, the photographer, the scholar, the kind young woman with so much promise. North Carolina Central University honored Danita's memory by naming the student newspaper's newsroom the Danita Smith Newsroom. Her photograph hangs on the wall, a reminder of the talent and passion she brought to her work. A picture of Danita remains taped to the wall outside the newsroom. Students pass it every day, many of them never having met her, but all of them aware of her legacy. Even now, nearly 2 decades after Danita Smith's murder, questions linger. Did Shannon act alone, or was she telling the truth about Germair's involvement? The evidence overwhelmingly points to Shannon as the shooter. The cell phone data, the gunshot residue, the gun purchase, the false alibi. All of it implicates her, and yet, Shannon's family remains convinced she was framed. What role, if any, did Germair play in the tragedy? Even the judge who sentenced Shannon acknowledged that Germair's actions, his affair with Shannon, his engagement to Danita, his failure to fully end the relationship with Shannon, created a perfect storm. He may not have pulled the trigger, but his choices set events in motion. Could Danita's death have been prevented? If Germair had been honest with Danita about his past with Shannon, would Danita have taken precautions? Would she have known to be wary of a burgundy Ford Explorer in the parking lot? These are the questions families ask themselves in the aftermath of violence. The what-ifs, the if-onlys, but there are no good answers. Only the silence of a young woman who will never graduate, never marry, never fulfill the promise everyone saw in her. In the end, the story of Danita Smith is a story about the fragility of life, about how one person's jealousy, one moment of rage, one pull of a trigger can end a universe of possibility. Danita was 25 years old. She had a camera that captured light and shadow. She had a thesis nearly finished. She had a wedding to plan. She had her whole life ahead of her. And on a cold January morning, as she walked down a stairwell with her purse in her hand, someone took all of that away. Shannon Crawley sits in prison, maintaining her innocence, insisting the real killer walks free. Jermaine Stroud lives his life, carrying the weight of his choices, whatever role they played in the tragedy. And Danita's family carries on without her, visiting her grave in Charlotte, remembering the daughter who loved photography, who dreamed big, who deserved so much more than she got. As you drift toward sleep tonight, remember Danita Monique Smith. Remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived with grace, with ambition, with a camera that captured the world as she saw it. Full of light, full of possibility, full of beauty. May Danita rest in peace. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far, the first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on to story number 4. Story 4. Tonight we're traveling to a small Oklahoma town, where a gesture of kindness would become a fatal mistake. This is a story about young love gone wrong, about jealousy, violence, and a confession that shocked the community. So, as we settle in, let me tell you about what happened on a June night in Henrietta, Oklahoma, when 23-year-old Anthony Hall's life came to a tragic end. Henrietta, Oklahoma sits in the southern part of Okmulgee County, about 50 miles south of Tulsa. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where generations of families have built their lives around coal mines, oil fields, and the land itself. Founded in the late 1800s when Hugh Henry discovered coal deposits on Creek Nation land, the town grew into a modest community that once boasted dozens of mines and thousands of workers. By 2015, it had settled into the quiet rhythm of small town life, with a population hovering around 6,000 souls. Jim Anthony Hall, though most people just called him Anthony, was born on November 10, 1991 in nearby Okmulgee. His parents were Jim Rhodes and Linda Ann Wilder Hanson, and he grew up in Henrietta, attending the local public schools alongside kids he'd known since kindergarten. Anthony's childhood wasn't without its sorrows. He lost his sister Holly at some point during his young life, a loss that shaped him in ways only his closest family members could truly understand. As a young boy, Anthony was like so many others in Henrietta. He knew the back roads, the fishing spots, the shortcuts through town that only locals recognize. For about 4 years his family moved to Iowa, giving him a broader perspective on life beyond Oklahoma's borders, but eventually they returned to Henrietta, drawn back to the familiar red clay soil and the community they'd always called home. By 23, Anthony had become a young man trying to find his way in life. His sister Amanda Feldpausch would later describe him as a good kid, someone with a kind heart who was still figuring things out. Like many young people in small towns, he worked local jobs, hung out with friends, and tried to navigate the complexities of early adulthood. Those who knew him said he was generous, the kind of person who'd help you move furniture, or lend you his last $20 without thinking twice about it. And it was this generosity, this fundamental kindness in his nature, that would ultimately lead to his death. Anthony met Samantha Stancifer when they were both young. He was around 20, she was 17. Their relationship began the way many first loves do, with intensity and passion, the kind of connection that feels all-consuming when you're that age. For Anthony, Samantha was his first serious girlfriend, his first real taste of what he thought love might be. For Samantha, Anthony represented something she latched onto with a fierce, possessive grip. But from the beginning, those closest to Anthony could see that something wasn't quite right. His sister Amanda watched as the relationship unfolded over the next 3 years, and what she saw troubled her. The couple was constantly breaking up and getting back together, caught in a cycle that never seemed to resolve itself. They'd be apart for weeks, sometimes months, and then suddenly they'd be together again, as if the problems that drove them apart had never existed. Amanda and other family members described the relationship as toxic. There were arguments, dramatic confrontations, and a possessiveness on Samantha's part that went beyond normal jealousy. In 2013, 2 years before Anthony's death, Samantha was actually arrested for domestic abuse, assault, and battery. The details of that incident weren't widely publicized, but it should have been a warning sign, a red flag that this relationship had the potential for violence. Yet, Anthony kept going back. Maybe it was because Samantha was his first love, and first loves have a way of blinding us to reality. Maybe he thought he could fix whatever was broken between them. Or maybe, like so many people caught in toxic relationships, he couldn't quite see how dangerous things had become. He told his sister Amanda at one point that he knew the relationship wasn't good for him, that he should have ended it a long time ago. But knowing something intellectually and being able to act on it emotionally are two very different things. By the spring of 2015, Anthony and Samantha had broken up yet again. This time, it seemed more final. Anthony, now 23, was trying to move forward with his life. He was living in his house on the south side of Henrietta, a modest place on West Dixie Street, where he was trying to build some independence and figure out his future. But Samantha was 20 years old and had nowhere to go. This is where Anthony's kindness enters the story in a tragic way. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the toxicity, the drama, the previous domestic violence incident, Anthony offered to let Samantha stay at his house temporarily. It would just be for a couple of weeks, he told his family, just until she could figure out her living situation and find somewhere else to go. His sister Amanda would later describe this as a kind gesture, which it was. Anthony saw someone he'd once cared about in a difficult situation, and his instinct was to help. He probably thought that because they were broken up, because the romantic relationship was over, they could maintain some kind of civil temporary arrangement. He likely believed he was doing the right thing, the decent thing. Samantha moved her belongings into Anthony's house sometime in early June 2015. On the surface, they maintained the pretense of being exes who were simply helping each other out, but beneath that surface, emotions were still raw. Samantha hadn't truly accepted that the relationship was over, and as the days passed, she watched Anthony with the kind of attention that comes from unresolved feelings and possessive jealousy. The evening of June 13, 2015 was warm, as Oklahoma summer nights tend to be. Anthony and Samantha went to a party together, whether as friends or something more ambiguous isn't entirely clear. But they were together, moving through the same social circles they'd always inhabited, seeing the same people they'd known for years. At some point during the party, Samantha glanced at Anthony's phone. What she saw there sent a jolt of fury through her. Text messages. Messages from another girl. In Samantha's mind, this was proof of betrayal, evidence that Anthony had moved on or was trying to move on, that maybe he'd been talking to this other girl even before their breakup became official. An argument erupted. The details of what was said that night were lost to the chaos of the moment, but witnesses later confirmed that Samantha and Anthony left the party together, tension crackling between them. They drove back to Anthony's house on West Dixie Street, where the walls held the history of their relationship, the good times and the bad, the laughter and the screaming matches. Once inside the house, something strange happened. The argument seemed to dissipate. Maybe Anthony, exhausted by the drama, just wanted peace. Maybe he apologized for whatever Samantha thought he'd done wrong. Maybe they both simply ran out of energy for fighting. They went to Anthony's bedroom. He changed into comfortable clothes, ready to sleep off the night's tension. Samantha was there too, and as the adrenaline of anger faded, they both began to settle down. Anthony climbed into bed. His breathing slowed, his eyes grew heavy. Samantha lay beside him, but sleep didn't come as easily for her. Her mind was still racing, still churning over those text messages she'd seen. Who was this other girl? What had Anthony said to her? How long had this been going on? She picked up Anthony's phone again. In the dim light of the bedroom, she scrolled through the messages, and there they were, more texts from the same girl. Fresh ones perhaps sent while they were at the party or on the drive home. Each message felt like a knife to Samantha's heart, feeding the jealous rage that had been building inside her all evening. Anthony's breathing had become deep and rhythmic beside her. He was asleep, vulnerable, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the woman lying next to him. Samantha got up. She told herself she was going to the kitchen to get a drink of water. Her feet carried her down the hallway, away from the bedroom where Anthony slept. She entered the kitchen, and in the darkness, she saw them lying on the counter, 2 kitchen knives. Later in her confession to police, Samantha would claim that seeing those knives sparked the decision, but text messages recovered from her phone in the days following the murder would tell a different story. In messages sent to a friend days before June 14th, Samantha had written about Anthony. She'd said she would either get him put in jail or kill him. The prosecution would later argue that this proved premeditation, that the murder wasn't a spontaneous act of passion, but something she'd been contemplating for days. Standing in that kitchen, Samantha picked up both knives. The weight of them in her hands should have given her pause. She should have set them down, walked back to the bedroom, and left the house in the morning. But she didn't. She gripped the handles tighter and walked back toward the bedroom where Anthony slept, completely trusting and completely defenseless. What happened next was savage beyond comprehension. Samantha entered the bedroom where Anthony lay sleeping, and she began to stab him. The first blow might have woken him, might have given him a split second to realize what was happening, but there was no escape, no time to defend himself. She struck again and again and again. The attack was frenzied and brutal. Samantha stabbed Anthony 58 times. She struck his head, his face, his neck, his torso. The knives rose and fell with mechanical repetition, driven by a rage that had consumed all reason. She slashed his throat to ensure he was dead, and then in an act of horrifying mutilation, she castrated him. The bedroom became a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the bed, the walls, the floor. One investigator who worked the case would later say it was the worst crime scene he'd ever encountered in his career. And this was a man who'd seen his share of violence and death. Anthony Hall, the 23-year-old who'd offered his ex-girlfriend a place to stay out of kindness, died in his own bed, killed by someone he'd once loved. In the aftermath of the murder, Samantha's behavior was chilling in its calmness. She was covered in Anthony's blood from head to toe, her clothes saturated, her hands sticky with it, but instead of fleeing or breaking down, she did something that would make this case infamous beyond the borders of Oklahoma. She updated her Facebook status. In the age of social media, where people share their breakfast choices in vacation photos, Samantha chose to share her crime. She typed out a simple message: "I did it, he deserved it." This was how Anthony's sister Amanda found out that her brother was dead. She was scrolling through Facebook when she saw Samantha's post, and in that moment her world shattered. She immediately tried to reach Anthony, but there was no answer. The terrible truth was settling over her even as she frantically tried to deny it. After posting to Facebook, Samantha picked up the phone and called 911. The call was recorded, and in it, her voice was eerily flat, devoid of emotion. "I killed my boyfriend," she told the dispatcher, and then she added something that suggested, perhaps, that some part of her realized what she'd done. "And now I can't kill myself." Henrietta police officers arrived at the house on West Dixie Street within minutes. When they pulled up, they found Samantha standing outside, drenched in blood. It was on her face, in her hair, soaking through her clothes. She looked like something out of a horror movie, but her demeanor was unnervingly calm. "I killed him," she told the officers. "I killed Anthony Hall." Inside the house, the officers found a scene of unspeakable carnage. Anthony's body lay in the bedroom, mutilated beyond recognition. The violence of the attack was immediately apparent. This hadn't been a single moment of lost control. This had been sustained, methodical brutality. Samantha was arrested on the spot and charged with first-degree murder. As officers placed her in handcuffs and led her to the patrol car, family members who'd heard about the Facebook post began arriving at the scene. Amanda Feldposh came with other relatives, desperate for information, hoping against hope that it was all some terrible mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. Her brother was gone, killed in the most violent way imaginable. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist Henrietta police with the case. Given the brutality of the crime and the fact that Samantha had confessed both on social media and to the 911 dispatcher, the investigation was relatively straightforward in terms of establishing guilt, but investigators wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened. They searched Anthony's house, collecting evidence and documenting the crime scene. They retrieved both knives that had been used in the attack. They photographed the bedroom, capturing images that would later be used in court to demonstrate the sheer savagery of the assault. Investigators also seized Anthony's phone and Samantha's phone. What they found on Samantha's device was particularly damning. In the days leading up to the murder, she'd sent text messages to a friend that revealed her state of mind. She'd written that she would either get Anthony put in jail or kill him. This evidence would prove crucial in establishing that the murder wasn't a spontaneous act of passion, but something Samantha had been contemplating. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rob Barris, began building their case. They interviewed Anthony's family members, who provided insight into the toxic nature of the relationship. They spoke with people who'd been at the party on June 13th, who confirmed that Samantha and Anthony had argued after she saw the text messages on his phone. They also uncovered Samantha's prior arrest for domestic violence in 2013. While she hadn't been convicted in that case, the arrest record showed a pattern of violent behavior toward Anthony. It painted a picture of a relationship marked by jealousy, possessiveness, and physical aggression. As the investigation progressed, details about the murder began to emerge publicly. The fact that Samantha had stabbed Anthony 58 times shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. The mutilation of his body added another layer of horror to an already horrific crime, and the Facebook confession made the case something that transcended the usual boundaries of small-town tragedy. It became a national story, an example of how social media had become intertwined with even the darkest aspects of human behavior. Samantha Stancifer made her first appearance in Okmulgee County District Court on June 25, 2015. Just 11 days after the murder, the courtroom was packed with Anthony's family members, including his sister Amanda, his aunt, and others who'd loved him, and were still struggling to process the enormity of what had happened. Samantha appeared before the judge, and those who saw her that day noted her demeanor. She seemed disconnected, showing no visible remorse, no tears, no signs of the emotional breakdown one might expect from someone who'd just killed the person they'd claimed to love. Amanda Feldposh would later tell reporters that Samantha had shown no remorse whatsoever when recounting the events to police, that it hadn't even fazed her to talk about stabbing Anthony to death. Samantha's attorney declined to comment publicly, focusing instead on preparing for what everyone assumed would be a difficult defense. After all, his client had confessed to the murder on Facebook, called 911 to admit to the crime, and been found covered in the victim's blood. The evidence was overwhelming. As the months passed, Samantha remained in custody at the Okmulgee County Jail. The prosecution continued to strengthen their case, gathering witness statements, forensic evidence, and the damning text messages that suggested premeditation. The defense, meanwhile, faced the challenge of representing a client whose guilt was not in question, but whose actions demanded some form of explanation that might mitigate her sentence. By April 2016, nearly a year after Anthony's death, it became clear that the case would not go to trial. Samantha's attorneys had advised her that given the strength of the evidence against her, her best option was to plead guilty and hope for some leniency in sentencing. Samantha Stansiffer pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Jim Anthony Hull. By entering this plea, she avoided a trial that would have subjected Anthony's family to the painful process of reliving every detail of his murder, but it also meant that she would face the full weight of the justice system's response to her crime. The sentencing hearing took place on a Friday morning, almost exactly a year after Anthony's murder. The courtroom was once again filled with his family and friends, people who'd come to see justice served for a young man whose life had been cut short by violence. District Judge Mike Claver presided over the hearing. He listened as District Attorney Rob Barris laid out the facts of the case, emphasizing the premeditation evidenced by Samantha's text messages and the extreme brutality of the attack. Barris described how Samantha had stabbed Anthony 58 times and slashed his throat to ensure he was dead. He reminded the court that Anthony had been asleep, completely vulnerable when the attack began. Barris also played portions of the 911 call that Samantha had made after the murder, her flat, emotionless voice admitting to killing her boyfriend. The recording sent chills through the courtroom. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Claver did not mince words. Looking directly at Samantha Stansiffer, he announced that she would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and then he added something that captured the sentiment of everyone who'd followed the case. He told Samantha that he was showing her exactly the same mercy she showed to her victim. The sentence meant that Samantha, who was just 21 years old at the time of sentencing, would spend the rest of her life behind bars. She would never walk free. She would grow old in prison, her entire adult life confined to a cell, a permanent consequence for a few minutes of murderous rage. For Anthony's family, the sentence brought a measure of closure, though no punishment could truly compensate for their loss. Amanda Feldposh stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing and spoke to reporters about her brother. She talked about how Anthony had been a good kid, how he'd tried to help Samantha even after their relationship ended, and how that kindness had cost him his life. The case had attracted national attention, partly because of the Facebook confession that had made it unusual, and partly because of the sheer brutality of the crime. It became one of many examples of how killers in the social media age sometimes confess to their crimes online, sharing their darkest acts with the world in a way that previous generations would never have imagined. In the years since Anthony Hall's murder, his family has had to navigate life without him. His sister Amanda became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, speaking about the warning signs that she'd seen in Anthony's relationship with Samantha, warning signs that in hindsight pointed toward the tragedy that would unfold. The toxic nature of their relationship, the cycle of breaking up and getting back together, Samantha's previous arrest for domestic violence, all of these were red flags that everyone recognized after the fact. But when you're in the middle of it, when it's someone you love making choices you don't agree with, it's hard to know how to intervene effectively. Anthony's death sparked conversations in Henrietta and beyond about domestic violence, about how it affects both women and men, and about the importance of taking threats seriously. The text messages Samantha had sent days before the murder saying she would either get Anthony jailed or kill him. Should have been treated as the serious threat they were, but like so many threats made in the heat of anger, they were likely dismissed as just words, just the drama of a failed relationship. Samantha Stansifer remains incarcerated in Oklahoma's prison system. She is now in her early 30s, serving out a sentence that will end only with her death. There are no news reports of appeals, no efforts to reduce her sentence. She has faded from public consciousness, just another prisoner among thousands, her brief moment of infamy reduced to a footnote in articles about social media confessions. Henrietta, Oklahoma continues its quiet existence, the kind of small town where this tragedy is remembered by those who lived through it, but where life has moved forward nonetheless. The house on West Dixie Street where Anthony died has likely changed hands, its history unknown to new occupants who have no connection to the violence that occurred within its walls. The murder of Anthony Hall is a story that contains several layers of tragedy. On the most obvious level, it's the story of a young man killed by someone he'd once loved, someone he was trying to help even after their relationship had ended. His kindness, his willingness to let his ex-girlfriend stay at his house during a difficult time, was repaid with unimaginable violence. But it's also a story about toxic relationships and the difficulty of escaping them. Anthony knew, intellectually, that his relationship with Samantha wasn't healthy. He'd told his sister as much, but emotional bonds don't break easily, and first loves have a way of keeping their hold on us long after we know we should let go. Anthony tried to maintain some connection with Samantha, tried to help her one last time, and it cost him his life. The case also highlights the dark intersection of social media and crime. Samantha's Facebook confession, "I did it, he deserved it," was a chilling example of how the platforms we use to share our daily lives can also become venues for confessing our darkest deeds. Her post was seen by friends, family members, and strangers, spreading the news of Anthony's murder before police had even finished processing the scene. In a way, social media added another layer of trauma to an already traumatic event, forcing Anthony's loved ones to learn about his death through a public post rather than through proper channels. And finally, it's a story about premeditation disguised as passion. While Samantha's attorneys might have argued that the murder was a crime of passion, committed in the heat of jealous rage, the evidence suggested otherwise. Her text messages from days before the murder, her calm demeanor after the killing, and the systematic brutality of the attack, all pointed to someone who had contemplated violence and then carried it out with deliberate intent. The story of Anthony Hall's murder is a reminder of how quickly life can be taken, how a gesture of kindness can turn fatal when offered to the wrong person at the wrong time. It's a story that resonates with anyone who's ever been in a toxic relationship, anyone who's ever ignored warning signs because they wanted to believe in the good in someone they cared about. Anthony was 23 years old when he died, barely into adulthood, with his whole life ahead of him. He should have had the chance to find real love, to build a career, to maybe start a family of his own. Instead, his life ended in a bedroom in Henrietta, Oklahoma, at the hands of someone who claimed to love him but whose love had twisted into something dark and possessive, and ultimately deadly. His family still mourns him. His friends still remember the good kid with the kind heart who was always willing to help. And somewhere in an Oklahoma prison, Samantha Stansifer serves out a sentence that will last the rest of her life, paying for those few minutes of violence that destroyed 2 lives. Anthony's ended, hers forever altered. This is where we leave the story of Anthony Hall. As you drift off to sleep, let this tale remind you of the fragility of life, the importance of recognizing danger even when it comes from someone familiar, and the devastating consequences that can follow when jealousy and possessiveness overtake reason. If you're still awake and listening, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. The late summer nights in Texas carry a particular kind of warmth. In August of 2014, the Shops at Legacy in Plano was the kind of place where young professionals gathered after work, where friends reconnected over drinks and laughter. It was a carefully designed complex where apartments sat above trendy restaurants and boutiques, where parking garages connected everything together. On the night of August 29th, it seemed like any other Friday. Christina Morris was 23 years old that summer. She had grown up in Plano, attended Allen High School, and knew these streets well. By 2014, she had moved to Fort Worth with her boyfriend Hunter Foster, but her roots remained in Plano. Her friends were there, her memories were there, and on that particular Friday night, she had plans to meet up with one of her closest friends from high school. Paulina Petrosky lived at the Shops at Legacy, in one of those apartments that overlooked the busy complex below. She had invited several friends from their Allen High School days to gather at her place before heading out to a bar. It was Labor Day weekend, and the timing felt right for a reunion. Christina made the drive from Fort Worth, excited for a night out with old friends. The group that gathered that evening included familiar faces from their teenage years. Among them was Enrique Gutierrez Aroque, someone they'd known from high school. He was 24, just a year older than Christina. They weren't particularly close, but they moved in the same social circles. That night, he was just another face in the group, someone to share drinks and memories with. The evening unfolded the way these nights often do. They talked. They laughed, they reminisced about high school. Around midnight, they decided to head to a nearby bar. The complex made it easy to stay close, everything within walking distance. They spent a few hours at the bar, the conversation flowing as freely as the drinks. By 3 in the morning, people were starting to think about heading home. Christina's car was parked in one of the parking garages at the complex. So was Enrique's. Around 3:30 in the morning, as the group was winding down back at Paulina's apartment, Christina said her goodbyes. She was ready to make the drive back to Fort Worth. Enrique left at the same time. It seemed coincidental, 2 people heading to their cars parked in the same garage. The parking structure at the Shops at Legacy was equipped with security cameras. These cameras captured something that would later become the most important piece of evidence in what was about to unfold. At 3:55 a.m., Christina Morris and Enrique Aroche were seen walking together up the ramps of the parking garage. They appeared to be talking, moving at a casual pace. The footage showed them disappearing deeper into the structure. A few minutes later, the cameras captured Enrique's black Chevrolet Camaro leaving the garage. His car exited, but Christina's car remained where she had parked it hours earlier, and Christina Morris was never seen alive again. The first days after Christina disappeared moved slowly for her family. When Saturday passed without word from her, her father Mark Morris wasn't immediately alarmed. Christina was an adult after all. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she'd stayed longer with friends than planned. But as Saturday turned into Sunday, and Sunday into Monday, the silence became deafening. On Tuesday, September 2nd, 4 days after anyone had heard from Christina, Mark Morris called the police to report his daughter missing. He described her calmly at first, trying to convince himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Christina was responsible. She kept in touch with her family. This wasn't like her. The Plano Police Department began investigating immediately. They started with the basics, retracing Christina's last known movements. When they learned she'd been at the Shops at Legacy that Friday night, they requested surveillance footage from the complex. What they found changed everything. The video of Christina and Enrique walking into that parking garage became the turning point. Christina's car was still there, untouched, but the cameras told a story that didn't match what Enrique had told his girlfriend that night. His phone records told another story entirely. When investigators first spoke with Enrique Aroki, his account seemed straightforward enough. He said he'd walked with Christina toward the parking area, but they'd separated before reaching their cars. He'd gone his way, she'd gone hers. He assumed she'd driven home safely. It was a simple explanation, the kind that might have been believable under different circumstances. But the surveillance footage contradicted his story. The cameras showed them walking into the garage together, not separating beforehand. And there was something else. Cell phone records showed that both Christina's phone and Enrique's phone had pinged off the same cell tower at nearly the same time that morning, suggesting they'd traveled together, at least for a while. As investigators dug deeper, they began speaking with the other friends who'd been out that night. One of them, Sabrina Boss, shared something that caught the attention of detectives. Earlier in the evening, back at Paulina's apartment, Enrique had made advances toward Sabrina. She'd rejected him. According to Sabrina, Enrique had left the apartment angrily after the rejection, and Christina had happened to leave at the same time. The investigation expanded. Detectives spoke with Enrique's co-workers at the Sprint store where he worked. Their testimony painted a troubling picture of the morning after Christina disappeared. Enrique had shown up to work 3 hours late on Saturday, August. When he arrived, his co-workers noticed something immediately. His hands and arms were covered in scratches and bruises. One co-worker, Jacob Talamontes, specifically remembered a mark on Enrique's arm that looked like a bite mark. When asked about his injuries, Enrique offered different explanations to different people. To one co-worker, he said his car's rim had fallen on him while he was changing a tire. To others, he claimed he'd gotten into a fight at the shops at Legacy. The inconsistency was notable. Why would someone give varying explanations for the same injuries? Investigators obtained a warrant to search Enrique's car, the black Camaro that had been captured on camera leaving the parking garage that morning. What they found during that search would become the cornerstone of the case against him. But first, there was something else that caught their attention. A detective named Fred Garcia was assigned to install a GPS tracking device on Enrique's vehicle. The hope was that Enrique might lead them to wherever Christina was. Garcia had installed dozens of tracking devices on vehicles over his career. But when he slid under Enrique's Camaro to find a suitable mounting spot, something struck him as unusual. His hand came out clean, completely clean. In all his years of working on vehicles, even brand new cars on dealer lots, he'd never encountered an undercarriage that clean. It was, in his words, better than showroom condition. There was also surveillance footage from a gas station in Allen, captured about 6 hours after Christina was last seen. The video showed Enrique using a squeegee to clean the back of his Camaro, paying particular attention to the bumper and rear section of the car. It wasn't the kind of behavior one typically sees at a gas station in the early morning hours. When investigators searched Enrique's home, they found cleaning supplies, lots of them, bottles of multi-surface cleaner, Odobon, a product used to eliminate odors, black Gorilla Tape, and a small handwritten note on a post-it, written in bullet points, black shirt, text messages, bank bills. To prosecutors, it looked like a to-do list of evidence to dispose of. To the defense, it was a list of items Enrique was gathering to help prove his innocence. The interpretation would become a matter of debate, but the most damning evidence came from the trunk of that Camaro. Crime scene analysts used a chemical compound called Blue Star, which reacts to the presence of blood, even trace amounts that have been cleaned. 2 areas of the trunk mat lit up under the Blue Star application. These samples were sent to the UNT Center for Human Identification for DNA testing. The results came back in December of 2014. Christina Morris's DNA was found on the trunk mat and on the rubber liner around the trunk lid. The DNA expert who testified later at trial explained that this wasn't the kind of DNA you'd expect from casual contact. It suggested a more significant source, likely a bodily fluid. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Christina was calculated at 1 in 1. Christina's father would later testify that his daughter would never have climbed into the trunk of a car willingly. Several friends and family members confirmed that Christina was afraid of the dark and would never have walked alone at night. For someone who was claustrophobic and frightened of confined, dark spaces, being in the trunk of a car would have been a nightmare. On December 13, 2014, nearly 4 months after Christina disappeared, Enrique Orochi was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping. The charge was significant because no body had been found. The prosecution would have to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and the inconsistencies in Enrique's statements. The trial began in September of 2016, almost exactly 2 years after Christina vanished. It lasted for days, with testimony from 73 witnesses and over 300 exhibits presented to the jury. The prosecution laid out their theory methodically. Christina and Enrique had walked to the parking garage together. At some point, something had gone wrong. There had been a physical altercation. Christina had fought back, which explained Enrique's injuries. She had ended up in the trunk of his car, whether by force or because she was already incapacitated. The defense argued that there was no direct evidence. No witnesses had seen what happened in that parking garage. No one could definitively say what had occurred after the surveillance cameras lost sight of them. Enrique maintained his innocence, insisting that he and Christina had parted ways peacefully, but the accumulation of circumstantial evidence was powerful. The DNA in the trunk, the cleaned undercarriage of the car, the injuries on Enrique's body, the lies he'd told to his girlfriend about where he'd been that night, the different explanations he'd given co-workers about his injuries, the cell phone records that contradicted his account of events, the damage to his car's front fender, which an accident reconstruction expert testified was consistent with striking something soft like a person's body. There were other details that emerged during the trial. Investigators had found pornographic images on Enrique's phone, disturbing content depicting violence against women. They found a notebook in his bedroom with a list of things to work on, and at the top of that list was "Stop lying." There was even testimony about an olive jar found in his room that investigators believed might be related to hechizo or witchcraft, though the judge ultimately ruled this line of inquiry inadmissible. Throughout the trial, Christina's family sat in the courtroom, searching Enrique's face for any sign of remorse, any hint of where their daughter might be. Her mother, Johnny McElroy, had moved from Tulsa, Oklahoma to Texas to search for Christina full-time. She'd lost her job in the process. Her father, Mark, had never stopped looking. Her stepmother, Anna, attended every day of the trial. They all wore purple, Christina's favorite color. On September 27, 2016, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of aggravated kidnapping. 3 days later, Judge Mark Rush sentenced Enrique Orochi to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 30 years. In the year before Enrique was led away, the judge allowed Christina's family to address him directly. One by one, they approached the witness stand. They begged him to tell them where Christina was. They pleaded with him to do the right thing, to give them the closure of knowing where their daughter lay. Enrique sat silently, looking down, offering nothing. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, still maintaining his innocence, still refusing to provide any answers. The years that followed were marked by ongoing searches. Team Christina, a group of volunteers who had formed in the days after Christina's disappearance, continued to comb through areas of North Texas. They searched fields, wooded areas, anywhere that might hold a clue. The family never gave up hope of bringing Christina home. Then, in March of 2018, nearly 4 years after Christina disappeared, workers clearing land for new home construction in Anna, Texas, made a discovery. In a wooded, secluded area about 40 miles from Plano, they found human remains. A skull was visible on a hillside, near what appeared to be a woman's dress and undergarments. The area where the remains were found was one that investigators had searched before, in the years after Christina vanished. But the thick brush and difficult terrain had made thorough searches challenging. Now, as the land was being cleared, what had been hidden for so long was finally revealed. Forensic investigators used dental records to confirm what the family both feared and needed to know. The remains were Christina Morris. After 1,285 days of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up, Christina had been found. The discovery was bittersweet. At a press conference, Christina's sister Sarah Estes spoke through tears. "We made a promise to Christina that we would find her and bring her home," she said. The family's statement reflected the complicated emotions of that moment. "Our hearts are irreversibly broken. We never wanted closure, even if there is such a thing. We only wanted Christina." Because of the advanced state of decomposition, medical examiners could not determine a cause of death. This meant that while Enrique Orochi was serving life in prison for kidnapping, he had never been charged with murder. The legal complexities were significant. He'd already been convicted of kidnapping Christina. Trying him again for murder, using the kidnapping as an aggravating factor for a capital murder charge, could potentially constitute double jeopardy. Still, the location where Christina's remains were found provided one more piece of evidence against Enrique. Cell phone records showed that his phone had pinged off towers near that exact location in the hours after Christina disappeared. The evidence had always pointed to him. Now, even in death, Christina's final resting place confirmed what investigators had long believed. In December of 2016, before Christina's remains were found, Enrique Orochi gave an interview from prison. He maintained his innocence. He said he hoped Christina was alive. He said he felt he'd been the victim of harassment and prejudice. He said his faith in God had grown stronger, and that he prayed every morning. He said he would continue fighting to clear his name. When Christina's stepmother Anna heard about the interview, her response was simple. "It's the same story he gave before. Poor me. I don't think any of what he has to say deserves a response." Enrique appealed his conviction, arguing that the trial should have been moved out of Collin County due to pre-trial publicity, and that the evidence against him was insufficient. In 2018, the appellate court affirmed his conviction. They found that he had not proven the media coverage was prejudicial, and they noted that Enrique himself had given multiple interviews to television, radio, and print media, sharing his own version of events with the public. To this day, Enrique Orochi remains in prison, serving his life sentence for the aggravated kidnapping of Christina Morris. He has never been charged with her murder. He has never told her family what happened that night in the parking garage, or why Christina ended up in the trunk of his car, or how she came to rest in that field in Anna, Texas. The case of Christina Morris became a landmark in Texas criminal justice. It was one of the first aggravated kidnapping cases in the state to result in a conviction without a body. The precedent it set would later help prosecutors in other missing persons cases, including the case of Tiffany Johnson, another woman who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. For Christina's family, the discovery of her remains brought a measure of peace, even as it confirmed their worst fears. They could finally lay her to rest. They could visit a grave, a physical place to remember her, but the questions that haunt them, exactly what happened in those early morning hours, why Enrique did what he did, whether Christina suffered, those questions may never be answered. The shops at Legacy continues to bustle with activity. People live in those apartments, shop in those stores, park in those garages. Most are probably unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there one late summer night. But for those who knew Christina Morris, for her family who still wears purple in her honor, for the investigators who worked tirelessly to find her, that parking garage will always hold a story of a young woman whose life was stolen from her, and a mystery that was solved through persistence, forensic science, and the refusal of those who loved her to ever give up. Christina was 23 years old. She loved the color purple. She was afraid of the dark and of tight spaces. She had a family who adored her, friends who remembered her smile, and a life full of possibilities ahead of her. What happened to her in that parking garage in the early hours of August 30th, 2014, robbed her of all of that. And somewhere in a Texas prison, Enrique Arochi knows the truth of those final moments. But he has chosen silence, a silence that will likely last for the rest of his life, or until his conscience can no longer bear the weight of what he knows. Thank you so much for spending your night with Midnight Crime Stories. I hope the stories kept you company and helped you drift a little closer to sleep. If you're still awake, leave a final comment. Tell me which story stood out to you the most tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calm, late-night true crime. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.